Kamikaze drones, taking inspiration from the Japanese offensive during World War II, or how they would strictly be called is loitering munitions. They were also used by India during Operation Sindoor. Kamikaze. This was an offensive launched by Japan towards the end of the war, where this was an authorized military operation where soldiers, pilots were told to go kill themselves.
It's the Russian way of war fighting. And we look at the Russians and we think, they don't have a NATO-style air force, they don't have glitzy jets, they don't have sleek tanks, and, their infantry looks slovenly, and, therefore they can't win a war. But then they are like boxers.
You have pilots piloting a warhead, something that's carrying a bomb into a target. But the pilot is not on that piece of equipment. He's far away somewhere using technologies that we talk about, first-person view and stuff like that. I think one of the good examples of such an attack was the very recent one, Operation Spiderweb by Ukraine, where Russian jets. Welcome to my defense. For the longest time on this podcast, I've been meaning to talk about one aspect of the future of warfare that we may have touched upon on various episodes, which is drone warfare. Especially in the context of Russia-Ukraine, because whenever we've talked about Russia-Ukraine over the last 3 seasons of In Our Defense, we've always talked about how this is that one sort of chapter in modern warfare that will be studied by militaries across the world for information on how the war of the future is to be conducted, breaking some and busting some myths as well, that future wars will not be long. This has been going on for quite a few years now. And one of those aspects has been the use of drones. And these are not your high-tech drones. These are your low-cost, cheap, rudimentary drones that you can just sort of fire and forget. Kamikaze drones, taking inspiration from the Japanese offensive during World War II, or how they would strictly be called is loitering munitions. They were also used by India during Operation Sindoor. And very surprisingly, especially for people who've been following this podcast and who know that we have a very strong ecosystem for drones, India does not yet make such drones in a large-scale capacity. Why is that? What are these drones? Where does this term kamikaze come from? For that, we have Sandeep Unnithan. Hey, Sandeep, or should I say, hey, my friend Sandeep, looking at what's happened in the world of geopolitics today.
Right. Hey, good to be back, Dev.
Yeah. Sandeep, on a tangent right now, as Jaishankar, when he must have been beginning his career in diplomacy and when he was learning the ropes, I really doubt that he would have thought that one day in the future he'd be India's top diplomat and he'd be having to decide when to let your prime minister put out a post on social media calling the US president my friend, because the use of that term in the last few weeks has become very, very controversial.
Very controversial indeed, Dave. I mean, who would have thought that, the Indian Prime Minister and the US President would reach where they are today, that even if you said something as innocent as my friend, it would, trigger off probably the stock market, but that tells you how unpredictable global geopolitics has been in the last couple of not years, but I would say days.
Yes.
Because we're talking of T20 of geopolitics
Actually.
Every single day. I mean, we hear it, see it all around us. You're talking of one thing in the newsroom and the next minute, Israel has launched a missile attack on Qatar.
Yeah.
So it's bizarre the way things are moving and how fast change is happening. Even as we speak, there's something or the other going on in some part of the world. I think it has to do with social media as well. Yeah, the speed of this. I saw this very interesting video. I'm not sure who it was. A young man who was talking about this phenomena of young shooters in the US. Right, in about a year's time, you had 3 white male shooters, all from privileged families. One attempted assassination of Donald Trump, one killing of a CEO, a very prominent healthcare CEO, and now this assassination of Charlie Kirk, and all 3 white male privileged kids in their 20s. And he said that, we're looking at a time when half of the administration is content creators. And then when it struck me, yes,
That is
it's
true.
Trump,
Yes.
the Trump administration, all content creators. You have talk show hosts, you've guys who've headed reality shows. So it's real time social media and content creation that's going on right now.
Yeah, in fact, when we were talking about this topic a couple of episodes ago, the dip in ties between India and the US, we were expecting them to normalize, but I don't
Yeah.
think we were expecting them to normalize so soon and so quickly, and
Yeah.
in such a fashion, by the way,
Yeah.
where you have the US president putting out such posts, and
Right.
then you have the Indian prime minister responding again on social media.
Yeah. You want to hear a military analogy for that? What we just saw?
What's that?
A conventional military offensive begins with an artillery bombardment.
Yeah.
Then the tanks move in, and then the infantry moves to capture space. So here, in the scenario of India-US ties, the infantry being the negotiating team, the artillery being social media, and the tanks, of course, being social media. And you have this massive bombardment of the Indian side by the United States saying, hey, you're doing this, you're ripping us off, you're doing that. So
Dead
all of,
economy.
that's the bombardment on social media, right? And so that the infantry, that is the negotiating team, can move in and get the best deal, out of us.
Yeah.
That's how it's playing out.
That's what's playing out. True that. But this is something that we're discussing in our morning edit meeting today, which sort of reminded me about what we've discussed, is that the two civilizational nations, China and India,
Yeah.
they've shown some wisdom that other countries perhaps have not when it comes to dealing with Trump. And it's just something that you've been advocating on this podcast, is just stay patient and stay
Yeah.
cool.
Keep calm, carry on.
Keep calm, carry
Right.
on. Don't worry about rushing into negotiations. Don't worry about having to sign deals and under gunpoint. Stay cool. Things will sort of eventually iron out, and that's exactly what's happening with India and the US. China, another matter, another story, but we'll see how that goes. But anyway, that's something we'll cover in future episodes, because like Sandeep keeps saying, like, we have 3.5 years more of President Donald Trump.
Yeah, possibly one more year if you look at the midterms next November.
Okay, interesting. Right. So let's talk about the topic at hand. Drones, kamikaze drones. Before we do that, I want a deep dive in history, because World War II is a fascinating chapter for me, and I've always wanted to see how on this podcast we can have bits and pieces where we talk about modern conflict, but also go back to what happened back then, because many of the technologies that we see today can be traced back then.
Of course.
So this is not exactly such a technology per se. This is the idea and the concept.
Yeah.
Kamikaze. This was an offensive launched by Japan towards the end of the war, where this was an authorized military operation where soldiers, pilots were told to go kill themselves. Special planes weren't made specially. But planes were fitted specially with some special munitions. They took off, mostly aircraft carriers, and then they just bang, went into ships and stuff like that. Some popular estimates say that around 2,600 aircraft were used. Around 4,000 pilots lost their lives, and more than 7,000 allied sailors were killed using these attacks. Sandeep, the very basic question to begin with: why did Japan feel the need to launch such an operation? And in the larger scheme of things of the World War II, where do you think this operation ranks in terms of did it meet what it set out to achieve?
No, absolutely not. Dave, and the fact is that you have to see, it was the Empire of Japan, and they had a very strict Bushido code, a warrior's code, which governed all of their fighting and the way they fought the war indeed. And this, towards the end of the war, when they began to sense that they were losing, that's when they started, sending all these young pilots in these suicide missions, one-way missions. They would be chosen from a certain, batch of them. And they were enthusiastic volunteers for this. Because, in the Bushido code, where the thing of dying honorably, that's given very, very great weightage. So you had these kamikaze pilots flying in straight into the path of US warships, because they all feared that massive invasion of the home islands that was coming. And they indeed planned for that, Operation Downfall, as it was called, before they actually ended up bombing the Japanese islands with nuclear atomic weapons. So literally thousands of these kamikaze attacks went through, and they sank multiple US warships. I'm not getting the numbers now, but several US warships were sunk by that. But it was too little, too late. The fact is that the Pearl Harbor attacks on the United States had awakened, in the own words of Admiral Yamamoto, it awakened a sleeping giant and filled him with a terrible resolve. Yeah. And once the American industrial capacity kicked into the war, they were literally producing a ship a day, a merchant ship, one merchant ship a day. So that was the industrial powerhouse of the United States. At the end of the day, it was just about steel producing nations. It was, the US was the world's largest steel producer, followed by the Soviet Union. So how stupid were these three countries who have ended up making the first and the second largest manufacturing countries and the steel producers your enemies? And once they combined, you had the Soviet Union, destroying the German Empire, and you had the United States destroying the Empire of Japan. But, since you raised the point about kamikaze drones, I want to take your attention during the World War to another theater, to the European theater, right? So while the Japanese pilots were throwing themselves at US warships in their one-way missions, in their flying their fighter aircraft, and they had specialized suicide aircraft as well. These were like, they were called OCAs. They were like special human torpedoes. You had the Kitons, I think they were called. And then you had these special one-person pilot rocket planes that were dropped from bombers, all kinds of very bizarre kind of things. But look what the Germans were doing back then. In the mid-40s, they had started the V1 and the V2 missile programs. Now, these were cruise missiles and they were ballistic missiles. So V1 was the cruise missile, slow flying. It had a turboprop engine, and it had a warhead of, I think, about 50 kilos. And then you had the V2, which was the ballistic missile. So the V1 was the forerunner of all cruise missiles that we see today, including the BrahMos. And you have the V2, which is the forerunner of all ballistic missiles, including the Scud and all its variants. So this was actually German engineering at its best, figuring out the most efficient way to drop ordnance on target. And they wanted to bombard a lot of British cities from their launch pads in the Netherlands. They would fly across the English Channel and they would literally shower, British cities with these V1 and V2 bombs. And the V1s were of course cruise missiles, and they're slow flying. So they even had a maneuver where the Royal Air Force would actually come and they would tip these, tip these missiles off course. They were that slow. You could, catch up with them with fighter jets, with not jets, but turboprop fighters that they had, like the Spitfires and the Hurricanes. Yeah. But the V2, of course, was a ballistic missile. It came down at much greater speeds, supersonic speed. So then those could not be intercepted. So you had the horrible thing of cities being bombarded and targeted day and night. And of course, the bombing of Germany began, strategic bombing. And of course, as Germany kept retreating away from the coastline, those V1 and V2 attacks were completely nullified. But the Germans were the forerunners of, they were the inventors literally of the cruise missile and of the ballistic missile. Technologies that we are wrestling with even today, almost a century later, 80 years later.
Yeah. Now, since you mentioned the Germans, there's a very strong argument and there's a very strong belief that if things had just been a bit different, the Germans actually would have been the first ones to develop the atomic bomb, and not the US. So, for example, if Hitler had not managed to piss off many Jews, we wonder why, Germany would have been the first country in the world to perhaps have the
I don't think it would have altered the course of the course of the war. It would just have, because at the end of the day, if you look at the size of the Eastern Front, the sheer expanse of the Soviet armies that were advancing onto Germany, you've angered a very, very powerful country and you've killed a lot of its citizens. So they came back with a terrible resolve, and they destroyed the German army in numbers that you cannot even imagine. Yeah. Some of the most titanic battles in all of human history have been fought on the Eastern Front between Nazi Germany and the Soviet army. So these are numbers like boggle the mind, in the millions. You're talking of entire armies being captured and circled and captured, and like the destruction of Army Group Center and all. So, these would just have been, even nuclear weapons. I don't think Stalin would have paused that red storm would have gone right through and went right through the heart of Berlin.
Yeah. And we are seeing glimpses of that in the Russia-Ukraine war, actually. I mean, Russia today is not the Soviet Union that it was back then. But for the last 4 years, Ukraine has held up.
Yeah.
But Russia has taken seemingly every blow that's been given to it. It's just resolve.
It
It's like a
is the
giant bear.
It's the Russian way of war fighting, and we look at the Russians and we think, oh, they don't have a NATO style air force, they don't have glitzy jets, they don't have sleek tanks, and their infantry looks slovenly, and therefore they can't win a war. But then they are like boxers. They have the ability to put up with a lot of punishment, and maybe it has to do with the kind of extremes of temperature that they undergo. If you've seen the ice dipping that they do, and they sit in the banyas in the superheated steam baths, and then they go and jump into an ice cold lake. I mean, I don't think there's any race on earth that has the ability to take such extremes of temperature. But that's the Russian people, and I think that is translated into their resilience, into their fighting spirit. And at the end of the day, it's actually Russians fighting Russians. If you look at it, it's the Slavs versus the Slavs. I mean, however much the Ukrainians may say they're different, they are essentially the same people. So if the Russians thought that it would be the Ukrainians were a walkover, certainly not the case, because they are that same resistance that held out against the Germans as well.
Yeah.
So that's how the Russians fight their wars, and they have the ability to absorb horrific numbers, unimaginable even in the 21st century.
Yeah, right. One last point on the kamikaze warfare of World War II, and I think that sort of also let us lead to where we are today and what we want to talk about. Do you think this idea is just something that is so sensational that that's why we like talking about it, or have military historians really placed any value to this concept, to this idea? Has it really impacted thought in terms of how to fight a war in the years since then? One of the reasons I ask this is because, I understand war, and I understand the fact that almost every soldier is trained and prepared to die. Special Forces operations, for example, when they embark on them, they have this thought in the back of the head that they might not be coming back. But that is still up to chance. There's still that 1% chance that you will all eventually, end up coming back. This one is guaranteed. This is a plan you've made to go and sacrifice your soldiers. This idea, it's very fascinating to talk about, right? Because it's very unreal. But has it really impacted military warfare thought in any ways in the years since, or is it just one small chapter of World War II that you think does not really deserve that much attention?
Honestly? Well, it is a small chapter. I mean, it's a very poignant chapter. It's, because there is the thing, while all warfare, I mean, as terrible as it is, all warfare, as you mentioned, has that element of extreme risk to life, and the fact that you might not come back from conflict, especially the soldiers in the front and in the forward thing of an offensive. But here you have a concept where you have soldiers being deliberately sent to their deaths, right? Primarily because they didn't have any other means of directing these weapons onto their targets, right? They didn't have the sophisticated, mid-course correction that possibly the Germans had. The Germans were far ahead technologically of the Japanese. So this was the only sure shot way of getting ordnance onto target, which is to send a man piloting this bomb. It's essentially a flying bomb with a propeller in it. Yeah. And the pilot basically flies it into the target, right? So that's the concept that the Japanese came up with, and their whole idea was that to use this as a bigger message to the invading forces, that if they tried an invasion of the Japanese home islands, the entire country of Japan would commit collective suicide, right? You saw that in the brutal battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, where the entire garrison literally, killed themselves. And they were prepared to do this on the home islands. And this is when the Americans said that they were going to take heavy casualties if they attempted an invasion. And which is one of those which is one of the logic that is made for using the atomic weapons. As terrible as it is, I mean, I don't buy that personally. The fact is that you don't need to bomb two Japanese cities to do that. Even the threat of an atomic explosion would have done that. But the Americans were very keen on studying the impact of this. And the weapon was not so much on the Japanese as much as it was meant as a warning to the Soviet Union.
Yeah, right. Let's come to today. Let's come to the modern war. Let's come to kamikaze drones. Similar concept. You have pilots piloting a warhead, something that is carrying a bomb into a target. But the pilot is not on that flying on that piece of equipment. He's far away somewhere using technologies that we'll talk about, first person view and stuff like that. I think one of the good examples of this such an attack was the very recent one, Operation Spiderweb by Ukraine, where it bombed Russian jets in their home bases. But before we get to that, the history of what actually is known as loitering munitions. What are these? When did they start taking shape, and why?
Well, again, they've loitering munitions because they're the cheapest way of getting ordnance on target. And the story again starts with the Germans in the 1980s. The Germans, being the technological geniuses that they are, in the 1980s, when they're faced with, during the Cold War, when they're faced with this prospect of a massive Red Army surge across Europe, they come up with a concept called the drone anti-radar, DAR. It's developed by a German company which is still around. It's called Dornier. And Dornier develops a delta wing design, which is the best way of flying a 50 kg charge onto the target. Not about, I think the first Dornier DARs were about 50 or 60 kilometers. It's essentially a pilotless aircraft with an explosive in its nose. It's a push propeller design, and it's a delta wing because it's the most efficient way. It's got very good lift characteristics, and it can, when it's doing that death dive onto the target, it's absolutely rigid. It can withstand a lot of G forces and all that. Exactly the reasons why a lot of aircraft designers prefer delta wings. The French, for instance, they love their delta wings on their Mirage fighters and all that. So Dornier came up with this concept of the DAR, but it wasn't put into large-scale production. It was a great concept. It was meant to attack enemy radar sites. So what it would do is just fly up. It would be launched in large numbers, and it would go and blind the enemy radar sites, and it would basically home on to these radars. It's a very inexpensive anti-radiation missile. It would lock on to the signature emitted by a radar site and destroy the radars. So what you would do is you would create huge holes at very, very inexpensive rates. You would just punch holes into the enemy's air defense cover and allow for your fighter jets then to move around freely. And that's exactly the concept that the Indian Air Force also has adopted. When about 2 decades ago, we bought the Harpies from Israel. The Harpy and then later the Harop. Identical configuration, a delta wing pilotless kind of aircraft, which is about 6 feet, 11 feet by about 4 feet wide. And it carries a charge of 25 kgs, 50 kgs and all that. It flies to a distance of about 400 kilometers. Those were the early variants. But of course, you have the newer ones which fly much further, much faster.
Right. The Russia-Ukraine war, what's been going on with these drones? Because we keep hearing about how they have been used in a massive manner by both sides. But that's more or less what we hear about, because I think after a point of time, Russia-Ukraine war also has become a bit, let's say, boring for people to read. Right? So you have, you don't really have so many headlines happening. But for people like you who've been following it off and on, who've been following it closely when the need arises, in the last 4 years, what's been happening in this war with respect to these drones that you and which makes you think that this is something that we absolutely need to talk about today?
Right. No, absolutely. Dave, so the war, as you mentioned, is entering its 4th year now in a couple of months. In about 4 or 5 months, we're going to be in the 4th year of the war, right? I never thought this war would last this long, right? And I'm sure neither did the Russians nor the Ukrainians. But here we are entering the fourth year of this longest war in Europe. And when the war began in 2022, began as a conventional war. You had tanks, you had artillery, you had fighter aircraft, you had special forces, infantry, all of that. Those regular, assaults that we were talking of, right? And these were beaten back. They were fought to a standstill. The Ukrainians inflicted heavy losses on the Russian armor. They shot down a number of their aircraft. All of that happened. And then what you saw then was in 2023, the Russians then moved back to they started playing to their strengths, which was artillery. So Russia, what a lot of people might have forgotten, is always been an artillery-heavy army. If you're looking at ordnance on target, Russians prefer dropping that ordnance through rockets, tube artillery, rockets and guns. So the war then began moving towards artillery. So you saw the Russians at one point were firing between 20 and 30,000 shells a day.
Wow.
And to give you an idea what 20 and 30,000 shells is, the Indian Army in the course of the Kargil war over 3 months, they fired 2.5 lakh shells. The Russians were doing that in a little over a week. They were literally firing millions of rounds of artillery. And so whatever gains they've made was on the back of artillery. But then in 2023, we saw a very interesting phenomenon unfolding, which was drones started entering the battlefield. And this is primarily because they've kind of exhausted most of their other stuff, right? Their tanks are being, their artillery guns, they don't have enough ammunition. So then they say, hey, listen, this is the best way of getting ordnance on target. And so you have the FPV drones, the first person view drones coming in, where you have guys literally taking these hobby drones, which were built for racing, and attaching an explosive onto it. In this case, RPG-7 shells were just strapped onto FPV drones, and they were literally piloted into targets. So that was the one drone at the lower levels. That's for the battalion level. At the top end, you saw the Russian Federation going to Iran and taking their Shahid 136 drone. Now the Shahid is an interesting drone. It is a copy of the same German DAR, the Dornier anti-radar, which the Germans had developed in the 1980s. And of course, the Israelis had picked that up as well. So Germans, Israelis, they're very good engineers. And the Iranians just took it, they copied it, reverse engineered a lot of the components. And because they didn't have an air force, they started producing them in the tens of the thousands. So then when the Russians went to the Iranians, said, hey, listen, you have this tech, help us set up our own production line. So you have a factory today in Tatarstan, in the Russian Federation, which is far north. It's about 1,500 kilometers plus from the Ukrainian war battlefront. And interestingly, it's just up the Caspian. So if you see, the Iranians can actually sail up across the Caspian and go up a river, and you land up at that factory in Yalabuga. And they've helped set up this massive plant. They've given them transfer of technology, and they're building these Shahid 136 licensed produced versions, which the Russians call the Geran, the Geran 1 and the Geran 2. Geran 2 is identical to the Shahid. And so in 2025, when you had 10s and 20 drones being fired, cruise missiles being fired, in September, you've seen 2 massive attacks where these drones have been fired in close to 1,000 a day, right? 800 drones are being fired in one go. Now, you just imagine that salvo of drones coming in. How many can you shoot down? 20%, 30% will get through, right? And they will hit your targets. They'll hit, your buildings. They'll hit command posts. They'll hit vehicles. Do all of that. So it's a lot of damage that can be caused at a cost that is just about $50,000 a drone. That's all it costs. And you're looking at a pilotless aircraft, which is about, like I said, about 11 feet tall and about 6 feet wide. It carries a 50 kg explosive to a distance of almost 2,000 kilometers. So you can launch them in very large numbers. And of course, like the Russians are producing them at scale. They're producing them like 10 and 15 a day, which is coming out of the factory. So there are those visuals that the Russians produced, this year to show this production line that was buzzing with all of these big drones, the black ones that are coming out, the Geran 2s, just to say that is psychological warfare, yeah? Russian style, saying we've got these, we're producing them at scale. Can you imagine the kind of damage that this will cause? And of course, the Ukrainians are doing the same as well. So both sides have this. And this drone, this particular configuration of the, call it the Dornier Dar or the Shahed 136, literally every country in the world is producing it now. Yeah. The Russians have it, the Iranians have it, the Chinese certainly have it, North Koreans are building them, and even the United States. The Lucas, which is the low-cost uncrewed system, which was just shown to the US Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, just a couple of months back, identical configuration as the Shahed 136. So everybody now is going towards these kamikaze drones, loitering munitions, as a means of, overwhelming the enemy with large numbers of these drones and basically causing entire air defense networks and grids to collapse under the weight of these, drone waves.
Yeah. Right. We'll talk now about what India has been doing with them. And that'll be a fun segment, I think, but after a quick break.
I think this new generation will be able to form the next government, and
I hope so. Firstly, I pray for all the Lord Pashupatinath that there is peace there, and they bring about change into their country, and it becomes it has such amount of capability to become a prosperous nation.
I want to talk about the civilizational links between Bharat and Nepal.
When our schools were there in Dehradun, I said in Dehradun, we have Nepalese students out there. There was no difference between he's coming from a foreign country. Some of the comedy also is like Indian comedy. They also have their kind of Kapil Sharmas and there's Adhikari there. The jokes are also similar.
Nepal government then took a decision when the Agniveer scheme came that they will not send their soldiers for Agniveers. How do you view the targeting not just of KP Sharma Oli, not just of the presidential palace, but several ministers, the IT minister, the home minister, I think 4 other ministers, the finance minister, dauda ke sadak par maar rahe the.
So Gaurav, in a country which is as small as Nepal is, if you have 8 to 9 lakh young boys and girls leaving their country every year for outside pastures and all largely going as blue-collar workers, I think this is a great loss to any nation.
There's one line which the Prime Minister said, which has always stayed with me. He said, Nepal has shed blood for every victory of India, every war that we fought.
Welcome back. Before the break, Sandeep and I were talking about kamikaze drones, how they've evolved since World War II. Not as though they were used in World War II, but how the idea of kamikaze attacks, which was made popular by the Japanese during the end of World War II, sort of reached to pilotless drones that can be sent into over enemy territory and basically then take out radars or whatever you want, basically. I want to talk about now what India's been doing with them. But before we do that, Sandeep, just one quick tangent. What you were describing before the break, it sounds like such a very simple concept. It sounds like a simple concept. And you also described that at the end of the day, no matter which side is fighting whom, both of them are using the basic core tech. It's not as though there's some major advancement being made in this field because you don't need to.
It's low tech.
It's low tech, exactly.
It's not rocket science. And there's no rockets involved.
Exactly,
there's no rockets. It's just a push prop, this thing.
It's rudimentary technology for that, and which makes it so enticing. So why is it that we're talking about it only in 2025? Have they been used before, or maybe in a smaller scale? That's why we haven't talked much about it, or perhaps there was no need for them to be used before this. I don't know what's happening.
Well, it's just like one of those things that have been around and no one's really figured out a need for it. And it so happens that someone who's fighting a asymmetric war decides to pick up this tech and use it, like the Houthis, for instance. The Houthis proved that in 2021 with their attack on the Saudi refinery.
Yes.
And those were, of course, Iranian one-way attack drones, which they used. So it's always these guys who come up with these innovative solutions and who will pull it out because they have no other ways of dropping ordnance on target. And they look for the simplest solutions, and the simplest solution happened to be these pilotless, drones that would drop ordnance onto these targets. And of course, in the Nagorno-Karabakh, you've seen them on a smaller scale in 2016. Almost a decade ago. But in 2021, with these attacks on the Aramco refinery, that's when it finally came of age. And then when you're left with nothing, when you don't have your fighter jets like the Ukrainians, you don't have fighter aircraft, you don't have a navy to speak of, then you go for the most efficient way of attacking the enemy. And that is, you have these capabilities, you have these very rudimentary technologies. What does it take? It just needs some basic aerodynamic structures.
Yes.
You have to have the capability to build those wings. You put one of those screwed 2-stroke engines onto it, and you fly it off with a GPS and a explosive, charge. So that's all they do, and you just make them en masse, on scale, and that's what both sides have been doing literally. And it's just the way warfare has evolved, and also the fact that when you're fighting a war of attrition. Think of it like a really bulky person who's running a marathon, right? What will happen to his body as he's running? His body, his fat, his muscle, everything starts breaking down beyond a point when he runs. I mean, this is a metaphorical marathon, of course. And this is what has happened in the Russia-Ukraine war, where you're actually seeing how combat has progressed from your conventional structures, your conventional fighting formations are all breaking down, and they're being replaced almost entirely by these new structures, right? And the Ukrainians were the first to master it because they were, of course, the underdogs in this battle, so they had to improvise and fight with what they had to. And then the Russians speedily innovated as well, because they also discovered, look, they were getting hit by these drones, so they started doing the same. So now you have drone-on-drone warfare there, right? So you're looking at the entire evolution of warfare over 3-4 years. And now a lot of the other countries are saying, we're stuck with all these legacy systems, especially the Taiwanese. If we don't go drone on the first day, you're not going to wait for all your legacy systems to be overwhelmed and all that before you say, no, I'm going to fight it. First, it will be Ukraine-Russia 2022, then it's going to be Russia-Ukraine 2023, and then finally I will, launch my drones and all. So that's what's happening literally now. Countries are figuring out, look, we have to launch very large numbers of these drones to overwhelm the adversary before he overwhelms us. Yeah. So it's become a kind of a technology leveler across the world. Exactly. It doesn't cost a lot.
Yeah.
I mean, if the Houthis can do it, any country in the world can do it. That's a good thing, and it's a very bad thing as well. It's a destabilizing thing, because if you're looking at it, all depends on the kind of mindset of the country that's involved. If it's a country that's got evil intent, it is bound to use this to overwhelm its adversaries, give it to non-state actors and all of that. Whereas if it's a country that's got a defensive mentality, I would say India is primarily a defensive thing. We don't attack anyone unless we are provoked, right? So it irrespective of whether you're an offensive or a defensive thing, it is woken up a large number of countries to the possibility of creating these very large drone forces at a fraction of the cost that it would take, for instance, set up an entire air force, or an entire navy, or an entire land forces thing as well. This is not to say that they will replace them. Of course, they augment the firepower that's available as of now.
Yeah, right. So what are we doing with it? During Operation Sindoor, we had both the drones that you mentioned, the Israeli drones, Harpy and Harop, making headlines. I mean, they were in the news. We got information that they were used, especially during the second half of Sindoor, where India decided to target Pakistani military installations. And the first step for that was to take out the radars so that your BrahMos could go and hit those targets. Drones is something that, in our defense, whenever we talk talk about drones, that's that one area where I've always felt that, okay, we can be happy about that. We have that foresight. Air Force has this incubator program, if I'm not wrong, for startups, where it sort of identifies and funds startups that it sees has potential in drone warfare. A couple of years ago, if I'm not wrong, a couple of years ago, the Republic Day, the meeting the retreat ceremony, you had this fantastic display of drones done entirely by startups of India. But I was very surprised to know that, or I was very surprised not to be able to find a lot of information about India producing these drones on their own. I mean, there's one name I got, which I forgot to note down, unfortunately. But that is still a prototype phase made by the the EEC, if I'm not wrong.
Yes.
Explosives, something, whatever.
It's the Nagastra one.
Yes, exactly.
Kamikaze
Yeah, that
drone.
one. Anyway, so what's up with this, Sandeep?
Well, as you mentioned, Dev, we've got plenty of startups. They're all doing their thing. They're producing these Kamikaze drones. But, the thing is that the bigger vision is missing. Like all these countries that we just discussed, whether it's even North Korea, China, of course, Russia, Ukraine, the United States, they're looking at procuring these drones in the tens of the thousands, if not the thousands, right? Which means that you have to place large orders and you have to build factories. You have to indicate that, look, this is my drone plan for the next 5 or 10 years. And then the industry comes in, they bid for it, you hand out contracts. We're not doing any of that. Nothing. It's just small little penny packet buying. There's 5 drones from here, 10 drones from there, one small company with 15 drones or 20 drones. It's very, very small scale. It's like you're trying to fill up a small piggy bank with, change. Whereas the serious countries who are involved in this kind of warfare, they're looking at building drone numbers in the tens of thousands, right? And we are caught, unfortunately, we're looking at drones as being, we're still in the pre-2022 stage. That yes, drones are important, but we need our fighter aircraft, but we need our tanks, we need warships, we need submarines, all of those things, which will come 5-10 years down the line. These are all futuristic acquisitions, right? Whereas these drones, exactly that we discussed, something like the Shahed or the Jaran or the Lucas, these are systems that can be built, acquired in 2 years. It can come out of factories, which you can set up literally in 2-3 years and commence production. And you can have, these weapons with the services in a very short span of time. But you have to order, you have to have that vision to say, I envisage the Indian military or the Indian rocket and drone force, which people are talking about, having 10,000 drones in all. And I will produce them at the rate of 5,000 a year. And this is how much I'm going to set aside for it. This is how we're going to procure it. And that is going to energize the whole system. Not if you go with emergency purchases, I'm going to buy 10 from here, 10 from there. And when you buy in such small numbers, 2 things happen. A, your cost goes up, right? The economies of scale never kick in. That's what happens. And that's what's happening here. And because we're not ordering them on numbers, there is no big Indian Shahed 136 or a Lucas or a Garan 2 program. Because, like I said, it's not rocket science. If everyone in the world is buying this kind of a design, is building their own type of design, even we have it. We've imported them from Israel at great cost. It costs 100,000 a piece, a Harpy and a Harop. These are good drones, but they're expensive. We need to build them on our own. We need to build them at scale. We need to bring down the cost. We aren't doing that, unfortunately.
If you were to take the example of the many things that we've discussed on this podcast, when it comes to, like you said, we don't have enough fighter jets, we don't have enough aircraft carrier, we don't have enough rifles.
Fighter aircraft, yes, of course.
Yeah. How do you think a low cost piece of tech can help you fill that gap in the immediate, and
Yeah.
obviously it will not be able to give you the full long term
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah,
in the immediate.
it is a gap filler. I'm not saying this is the future of warfare. It possibly isn't. The future of warfare is possibly AI-driven autonomous drones that are
Yes.
taking their own decisions. God forbid we get to that part. But the this is the present state where warfare is today, and it is these low-cost, uncrewed, one-way kamikaze drones. Call them what you want, but this is the way wars are being fought today. And in the short term, if you want to fill your gap in numbers, if the Air Force has a 15 or a 20 squadron shortfall in fighter jets, possibly you could induct 10, 15,000 of these. And that would immediately take away that much of pressure off the Air Force to attack enemy targets, right? How many targets would you need to do a realistic assessment of your enemy countries and how many targets you need to hit in that, and then draw up a list of how many drones you need to strike at all, because I'm assuming all your enemies, adversaries are on your borders.
Yes.
And if they're on your borders, then you can strike at them using these kind of solutions, right? I'm not saying you don't need fighters, you need fighters, but those are going to take time to come. They will take 5, 10, 15 years to be delivered. You're talking of a 5th generation aircraft that will come a decade from now, the indigenous one. You're talking of nuclear powered attack submarines that will come 15, 20 years into the future. So all of these platforms will come so far in the future that they're not going to help you today to fight the wars of today. If you're looking at an Operation Sindoor, which is an ongoing operation, by the way, you would need something in the short term, in the next 1 year or 2 years. And it would be, solutions like this, which Indian industry can make very easily. You don't even need to go and get a imported solution. You can, reach into your innovators. Your every single service today has tie-ups with industry, with startups and all that. Possibly here is something you can come together and come up with a program for an Indian Shahid or an Indian Lucas, and then build them, perfect the design, and then build them on scale. Get multiple factories going. There are lots of Indian factories that are lying vacant, ordnance factories, ex-ordnance factories. They don't have orders, right? They've been created for a purpose which possibly doesn't exist now. Convert those into drone factories and start producing them. Produce them, get them into your services, possibly export them as well. Make in India, export for the world. Those kind of things. So these are, I'm saying these are low cost solutions that are staring at you in the face. You don't even have to invent anything. It is very simple. It's QED. It's a problem that you have. It's a solution that you have. Both of these things are there with you right now.
Yeah. So on the point of why don't we have them right now, where would you lay your finger if I were to ask you to tell me what's the reason for us not maybe perhaps going in that direction? Is it that there is not much serious thought being given to this concept in the first place within the forces or in the Ministry of Defense? Or is it that while the officers are talking about it, while there is some conviction that this is what we need, maybe it's not reaching the right levels in the government for it to become a larger conversation where, like what you said, a proper vision and a policy can be made nationwide for all the three services? Or is it something that we briefly discussed about when we talked about rifles? That this is such a unsexy, such a very low sort of a. It doesn't really strike you as something that, oh my god, this is something you have to pay attention to. When you have Indian military, you have a plethora of problems. You have very expensive problems to fix. Right now, this does not strike you as something like, oh, this needs my urgent attention. Where do you think the problem lies?
I think it's a combination of all of this that you've mentioned, and the fact is that there's nobody really batting for a drone force.
Okay.
Because let's look at it very objectively. A drone force actually threatens legacy systems.
Yes.
So if you have a force that is structured around manned aircraft, for instance, or manned warships, or battle tanks, artillery, they will see something like this as a threat to turf, right? So that to my mind, is the most obvious answer. And the fact is that nobody's really pushing for these systems. I think everyone's waiting for a drone and a rocket force to be set up, and then they will do the procurements and stuff like that. But that said, I think the services are focused on their operational requirements for now. There's nobody who's doing that big picture thinking.
Right.
That we need to have, say, the vision that the Prime Minister had on the 15th of August when he spoke at the Red Fort, where he said you need to have a Sudarshan Chakra,
Yes.
that which is basically a ballistic missile defense shield with an offensive element as well, which will defend our vital areas, vital points from enemy missiles, drones, and attacks from fighter aircraft, and also strike at them. So I would imagine, a drone force like this, if you're to acquire them in numbers, would be part of a shield like this one, right? But again, somebody else has to do that kind of thinking, and it's not going to come from the services, I feel, for precisely the reasons I mentioned, that it threatens existing forces, structures, turfs. What's going to happen to my beautiful destroyers and my submarines and my manned aircraft and my tanks? And, so militaries, it's not a very unique Indian problem. Militaries all over the world have this problem, because until your feet are in the fire, you wouldn't really know. So what I'm saying is that, look, I'm not saying you don't need tanks, warships, submarines, fighter aircraft. They will continue for decades. But you need to look at a low-cost solution to deliver ordnance on target that could possibly allow you to use your high-value targets, keep them in reserve. If the war escalates, for instance, you bring them in at that point. But in the opening salvos of your war, exactly the way artillery is used, use these as you would use artillery shells.
Yeah.
And that's what the Russia-Ukraine war has taught you. But you got to have them. You cannot, have them in 2s and 4s and 10s and, buy these little things. Because then they'll be like, gold-plated acquisitions, because the producer, looks at his order size, which is in 2 digits, and then he tries to load his entire thing on, that contract. Rather than if you had a larger numbers, simple economics, larger numbers, cost of production comes down. And, there's going to be a lot of downstream effect as well. When you do these large numbers, it will kickstart a whole lot of other industry innovation.
Yeah.
It will bring down the costs substantially. It will allow you to, build a whole range of such products, not just for the military, but for the civilian market as well. So this whole thing about drones, it's no longer, that little fringe thing, it's good to have, nice to have, and those kind of things. Today, it's an essential part of warfighting, as Russia-Ukraine has shown us. So you've got to have them in numbers. You've got to use them in a way that it deters the enemy from trying to, surprise you. And I say this because we have a live situation on one border, and the Western adversary is not sitting quiet. For all you know, he's possibly shopping around to buy precisely this kind of technology to produce these kind of drones in large numbers that he will use against you in the next battle whenever it comes.
Yeah, right. One more point on this topic is how does the use of such inexpensive drones that does not lead to any human lives lost on your side, at least. There's no threat of missing pilots. There's no threat of downed pilots.
Yeah.
And there is there's the potential of causing widespread, if minor but widespread damage. So how does that impact what we've discussed when it comes to warfare, the escalation matrix, or does it at all? Because if you have both the sides with the same piece of tech, then it's like you were talking about earlier, it's sort of a leveler. So does this in any way change a commander's point of view of how do they wage warfare, knowing what these can do at a very low cost and without, like I said, a lot of damage, at least on your side?
Well, the fact is that the enemy is going to be more conscious about your capabilities. It's all going to be how many numbers you can fire on the adversary. And if you're looking at the Western adversary, and say, for instance, if he's got 2,000 targets, military targets, and we have the ability to hit all of them simultaneously in a day, that would throw him into a quandary. And if that kind of were communicated, that would force him to rethink
Interesting.
any provocative. So it acts as a deterrence. It acts as a deterrence against any possible sneak attack or any terror attack, and those kinds of things. But having said that, you're at the receiving end of the other adversary to the north, who possibly be thinking the same. So you need to cater for this two-front solution, and I think in the short term, this could be the one thing that would actually be a game changer, if you can call it that. And you need to look at it at three levels. At the lower level, you have drones, you have your FPV drones. Those are being inducted in large numbers. They're inexpensive, and I think it's there at the battalion level and even above. At the second tier, you need to have these drones, which will, be the Shahid type of variety of drones, which will add teeth to the Navy, to the Army, and to the Air Force. And then, of course, you have at the upper tiers, you have your BrahMos missiles, and you have, and going forward, this hypersonic missiles will come in. So you're primarily looking at a whole new way of war fighting, where the first day of the war, which is the most dangerous days of the war, because you're looking at an enemy that's fully primed for conflict with his missiles locked and loaded, and you won't have to send your manned fighter aircraft into harm's way. And we've seen that playing out in during Operation Sindoor, when the first initial salvos, it did cause some casualties on our side.
Yeah.
In terms, not casualties, but the initial things suggest that there were some losses on our side in terms of numbers. No lives lost, fortunately. But we corrected our strategy, and this is going by what the government and the Defense Ministry spokesperson and, of course, the Chief of Defense Staff have mentioned, that we corrected our strategy, and, of course, we saw what happened on the 10th of May, just a few days later. But it is technologies like this that will allow us to deter our adversaries from carrying out attacks like this without putting our pilots in harm's way, putting our personnel in harm's way, and also carrying out these attacks to ensure there's no collateral damage, because these are very accurate weapons.
Yeah.
They can be flown very precisely to attack military targets. And since we are never in the business of attacking civilians, and our stated aims from day one have been very clearly to first attack only the terror targets, wherever the terror training camps, and then finally the military targets when we were provoked. So I think this adds an element of lethality to your existing force structures, and that's one of the reasons that they should go in for this.
Yeah, right. One quick final point is, when I was looking at the list of such drones in existence in the world right now, and who has which and who has how many and who has not, how many is very difficult to find out, but who has which, I was quite taken aback to see that the Israeli Harpy and Harop are actually very, very, very popular across the world.
Yeah.
So what is it about these two drones that makes them so popular across with many countries?
Well,
including India, by the way.
Yeah. So you have to give it to the Israelis. I mean, they're so ahead on the tech spectrum that, I remember seeing these, the concept of a loitering munition. It was completely new to me, and I think it was on a visit to Israel more than a decade ago when we got a demo of this. The IAI guys had pioneered some of these concepts, and they said that, look, a loitering munition is something that you can just think of it as a weapon that you launch in the air, and it's literally circling over there, waiting for a target to materialize. And when it does, it swoops down on the target and hits it. So this was, of course, in the concept, this was in a time of post 9/11. You're looking at the war on terror and all of that. So this was seen as an adjunct to that, where you would want to take out, say, specific targets like a pickup truck or something like that, right? But now, of course, warfare has changed. You're looking at countries now that are fighting wars of attrition, militaries fighting other militaries and not non-state actors. So this would become completely different. Then you would go into your traditional missions like suppression of enemy air defenses, which is what loitering munitions were developed by the Israelis. The Israelis developed the Harpy and the Harop precisely for this. It's a very, very devastating weapon. It's homes in. It's an anti-radiation missile primarily. So it homes in on radar emissions with great accuracy over 100 kilometers away, and they charge top baller for that. Because they were one of the first to pioneer the concept of that. But then a lot of other countries then got into the act, and they said that, especially the Iranians. So the Iranians were watching this very carefully when the Israelis came up with the Harpy and then the Harop. And that's when the Shahid kind of entered the picture, when they started looking at this as a possible low-cost option for their forces. And that's how they started, buying the German technology. They've got some of these two-stroke engines from Germany and reverse engineered those. So they've done a lot of jugaad to existing designs, and they finally perfected this. And now today they are literally one of the leaders, probably one of the top 5 countries in the world that have this capability, the Shahid 136. So it was the Israelis who began with this whole thing, and they pioneered it in the recent past. Of course, the Germans invented it, the Israelis pioneered it, and the Iranians went to the mass production phase. They've mass produced it in a way that no other country has.
Right. So cool. Let's see what India does with it, because I think you're right. Because when you're talking about that, if you put your mind to it, India can easily do it as well. This does not seem like technology that requires years and years of research.
It's not a 5th generation fighter aircraft. It's not a nuclear powered attack submarine. It's certainly not a 5th generation an advanced battle tank. It's something that's already exists. It's just a question. The pieces are all there. It's just a question of putting them together and making them on scale.
Yeah. So let's see if India does that, and if it does that, we'll be more than happy to talk about it on this podcast. Thanks, Sandeep, so much. Fantastic chat as always. Had great fun.
Thanks for having me, Dev.
And thanks to all our listeners and viewers. That's it for this week's Defense Dose. For more, tune in next week. Till then, stay safe and do not cross any boundaries with your passport. Bye-bye.